So what are we just hearing there?
The moorhen.
Professor Hugh Possingham is both a mathematician and an ecologist who is becoming increasingly alarmed about what the numbers are telling him.
The maths tells us and the modelling tells us, unless a species has at least 5,000 individuals, that's a lot, and many of our species are way below 5,000 individuals, their long-term future is precarious. There's the cane toad calling.
7:30 caught up with the former Queensland chief scientist at one of his favourite bird-watching places, Brisbane's Sherwood Arboretum. What's so special about this place?
There's a nice diversity of habitats. We have recorded over 170 bird species here in this little park.
Professor Possingham says birds are a good indicator of the state of the environment, and the latest surveys are deeply worrying.
I co-created the Threatened Bird Index with BirdLife Australia and the Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network. And that index tells us that the overall abundance of threatened birds is going down at about 2% every year. So it's a 2% decline in all our threatened birds, and that's been going on for 20 or 30 years.
For the past 2 decades, the key piece of legislation to protect threatened species is the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. How has that act performed over the last 20 years?
Well, if you rate its performance on how well threatened species are going, it's not performing at all.
So why has it failed? What do you see as the fundamental weaknesses of the Act?
A lot of it is it's just not fully enforced. So we know that 7 million hectares of habitat of known threatened species, that's 1% of Australia, that habitat has been destroyed in the last 20 years. And most of that destruction was never referred to the Commonwealth Government. So it's like there's no way of stopping it if it doesn't go to the government. So there aren't the people on the ground.
And is that because it's self-assessment, that landholders themselves determine whether a species is threatened by land clearing?
That's right. A lot of it is a self-assessment thing. If it's a big and obvious project, like a government project or a coal mine, then clearly it's going to be assessed because it's very much in the public eye, and they all get assessed, but then a lot of the other clearing for threatened species isn't assessed.
There's no mention of climate change in the current Act. Should there be?
Definitely. I mean, in 1999, when the Act was first brought out, climate change was known. Most people were saying it's happening, but it wasn't perceived as a major threat to biodiversity. Now, after land clearing, it could well, by 2050, it could be the biggest threat to biodiversity.
While Professor Possingham finds peace in this city sanctuary, he's also seeking assurance that the federal government will deliver on its promise to reform Australia's most important piece of environmental legislation. How confident are you that you will see the sort of reforms that you've been calling for?
I'm always optimistic, and I believe the intent. Australians don't want to lose their flora and fauna. How can we let our threatened species decline at 2% a year? If our economy was going down at 2% a year, it'd be terrible. If people were dying earlier every year for the last 20 years, there would be an uproar. If the hospital waiting lines were going up 2% a year, year after year, there'd be chaos.
But there are so many competing interests at stake. Landholders don't want to be told what to do with their property. How can we find common ground?
Well, I think actually all the landowners I talk to care as much about threatened species as I do. I think all Australians don't want any more extinctions. It has to stop. It has to stop now. So landowners want to be given the means and the resources to steward the threatened species on their property. Landowners also have to have a viable livelihood. So they need stewardship payments, they need compensation, and they need the tools to work with government and not-for-profits and independent organisations to save threatened species. But I think they all want to do those things.